Welcome to the fifth module of Using Vue with ASP.NET Core by Example. My name is Sean Wildermuth. In this module, we'll talk about centralizing state. We're going to start by discussing sharing data across your components. We'll then introduce Vuex. We'll create a new Vuex store. I'll show you how to use Vuex stores across components. We'll refactor our example to centralize some responsibilities, and then I'll talk about modularizing Vuex stores. Let's get started. So let's start by showing how to share data across components. Back in Visual Studio, I'm going to create a new file here in the JS directory, and I'm just going to call it the data store. And this will be a simple object that we can share across different instances of components. So we'll start by just creating a simple catalog, and this will be the actual shared instance of the data we have in the catalog. And I'm just going to start it with an empty array. And we also are going to need a function to actually load the catalog. And in this case, we'll just return a new promise. That promise will actually have the bulk of the code we want here. And this function that we're using inside the promise is going to have a resolve and a reject. These are essentially callback functions that will tell the user of the promise whether we successfully did what we wanted or whether we unsuccessfully did it. And so essentially, we'll call resolve with data if necessary, or we'll call reject with error information if necessary to show the result of the asynchronous call. So what are we going to do on the promise? We actually go back to our index page. I'm going to come down to this call we made inside the mounted function, and I'm going to use it inside of our promise. This way, no matter who calls load catalog, we'll be able to get the list of products and then return them. We're not being bound to just using them inside index page. The only difference is since we don't have the idea of the error and the is busy, we can get rid of those things and we can continue to set those in index page. But for us, instead of setting the products, we're going to actually say resolve and then send down the results of the call. So if we succeed, we're going to send to the caller of this the data that's actually being returned by the call to the get. We can get rid of these binds as well since we're not going to use anything in this pointer. And then in the catch, all we're going to do is call reject. We could tell it about what's wrong, but in our case, we're not going to send that error information. We're just going to say if we succeeded to make the API call, resolve. If not, let's go ahead and reject it. With this in place, let's replace this call to Axios with what we really want to do, and that is to call the data store dot load catalog. And because this returns a promise, we can just deal with it with a then and a catch, just like we were going to do before, except that instead of returning the function, this is actually going to be the results we wanted. So in this case, it'll just return and we can set the results, and the is busy can still be set. And in this case, the error is going to do what it continues to do. So really no different than what we wanted to do. The difference here is even though load results returns the data, in most cases, we're not going to want to actually resolve with the actual data. What we want to do is say this.catalog equals the results. We want to change the data store's actual data with the results here. In theory, this means that here at the index page, I should be able to just bind the products to datastore.catalog, right? That should work. It doesn't though, and the reason is that we can certainly bind this data store catalog here, but here when we set it, we're losing the object identity. What I mean by that is when the binding happens here, this binding is probably happening before load catalog is happening, and so it's being bound to this empty array, and then what happens? We assign our local to a whole different object. That object contains a new array, and Vue doesn't know about this change, and so it gets confused between them. So alternatively, we could get into the business of using something like Lodash to say for each. Then we can do the same thing of res data.results. Then we can just have a little iterator here that's going to allow us to say this.catalog.push, push the new object in. And while this works, what we're going to find out pretty quickly, let's get rid of that, is that it means we're going to need to be really careful with how we deal with this array or any array we're going to be using in sharing data across. So let's go and see if this works, and then we'll talk about the approach. If we go back and open up our index page, we're going to need to include this new data store in our project. So that's right before the index page. Let's go ahead and include that to make sure we have it. And then because we're loading both of these, let's see if it actually works. So it's showing that we couldn't load the products. But if we look at the network tab and refresh, we'll see that we retrieved the products fine. So what must be going on? Remember, we moved the same get over. And the problem is that this pointer, just like we were seeing before, isn't going to be this catalog anymore. Because we're using these nested functions, one here, one here, one here, we end up having to chain all these together. We can make this work by doing the same trick we've been doing. At first, this load catalog level, and then at the callback from the for the then, and then again in this for each, which means we're having to think about not only the pointers here, but also managing this catalog very carefully. So if we come back here after making those changes, we should be able to get our product before, but we've had to go through a lot of trouble just to get to this point. So my suggestion is because we're really troubling ourselves with managed state instead of managing all the state here at the index page, but jumping through hoops by doing this in a simple way, we have a couple of issues here. Remember that any code here could also go ahead and do something like datastore.catalog equals and empties the state. We're really telling it that any piece of code anywhere can mangle the state. We don't have very good ways to handle how this state is being touched. Again, with a small page where you're doing some simple things, maybe you just have a couple components you want to talk through. This might be an appropriate way to do it. But in most cases, we're going to want to do something different. And that's where we can bring in something like an actual data store, not just an object with some properties on it. Let's see that next. So what is Vuex? Vuex is a library written by the Vue team to handle just these sorts of problems. It introduces a store model for state across your application. It doesn't mean that Vuex will be required for every Vue project you might want to use, but when you start to build larger and larger Vue projects, Vuex tries to centralize a lot of the state that needs to be shared across components so that it will simplify and lower the number of paths for changing, manipulating, or mutating that state. It reduces where the data is mutated so that it's easier to debug as your projects get larger and larger. It can introduce more concepts, which means more conceptual complexity. But if you're dealing with a large enough application with enough developers, funneling all of those changes through something like a Vuex store will actually simplify things. So Vue components, when they're dealing with Vuex, are going to use dispatching to have actions happen. The actions make mutations or changes to state, which will then change the state itself, and that state will know to call the component to be re-rendered with the new version of that state. So effectively, a Vuex store is going to have several pieces to it. The state, which is the actual data that you want to share across your application. It's going to have mutations, which are pieces of code that can actually change the state. Instead of having everyone willy-nilly make those changes, they want to centralize anything that changes the state. They have actions, which perform some tasks that will eventually call mutations if there is a change in state. So the idea between mutations and actions are whether state is being changed or not. Keeping all of the state changes in mutations is the suggestion. And finally, it has getters, and you can think of getters as something akin to global computed variables. So while much of your application may get access to state by calling the state directly, getters are a way to compute some value based on the state, but also to notify different parts of your application when the underlying state has changed for those getters. Let's bring in Vuex into our application, and you can see how it works more directly. So now let's introduce the Vuex store into our application. First, we're going to go over to the package.json. We're going to add Vuex as another library we're going to use, and it's just called Vuex, and we're going to use whatever is the latest version. And once it gets the packages, we're going to want to include Vuex here in our giant list of libraries. And then here in the data store, I'm going to change this data store to be a new Vuex object instead. We can still have the notion of some of these pieces, but they're actually created as a collection of those different pieces I talked about. So first is going to be state. This is going to be an object that's going to contain the different pieces of state we're dealing with. And right now, that's just going to be the catalog. And here I'm going to create a section for mutations, actions, and getters. And notice how each of these are just an object with named properties. So let's start with a mutation that I'll just call setCatalog. And setCatalog will just take a function that first passes in the state object, and then any associated parameters that are needed. In this case, it's going to be the new catalog. And then the function itself will simply say state.catalog equals new catalog. And the idea behind this is we don't want this to ever be written unless it's inside of a mutation. We're trying to create a funnel through which all changes to the state are going through the same place. It makes debugging it easier. In fact, we can put up here strict true to enforce that. We can tell it that if we see any changes to catalog outside of a mutation to actually throw an error at runtime. But what about this load catalog? So most of what's happening in this load catalog is actually an action. So we come back here and put it in actions. We're going to do much of the same thing we did before, except we're going to pass in an object called a context. This context is going to be essentially a doorway into the different things that can happen inside the store. So this code ends up being primarily the same. We're still going to do the things, except that when we come down to actually make the changes to the data, first of all, we can get rid of all the binds, because this pattern solves most of those problems for us. And then we can call context.commit, and then the name of the mutation, set catalog, and then what are we going to pass in here? res.data.results, right? The catalog committing is essentially saying, go ahead and call a mutation, call set catalog, and pass this as the second parameter, or however many parameters you actually end up needing. Because of this pattern, we're saying some action we want to do, like in this case, calling a service, have the actual mutation of state happen in the mutations, and then we have the actual state. And by convention, they want you to call this store as a global object. It's this singleton that's going to be used by the entire application. And what's interesting about the way this is going to work is over here in the main object we're going to use is instead of having a products at all, we're going to actually instantiate the store here in the view as its own property. What ends up happening is that this store is propagated not only to this Vue object, but to everyone down the line, to every component that it uses. It will also have access to this specific store. So how would we change the bindings to make this actually work? The trick here is let's open up the index.cs HTML. And if you remember, we have this v4 to go from products. So instead of products, it's actually going to be $store.catalog. Now in the bindings, I kind of hate to do this. What I usually do instead, in fact, is let's go back here, is I actually end up making a calculated or a computed field for each of these. And there's actually some code inside of the Vuex that can help you map these properties more easily. But for us, I want you to see what's happening on the raw. So I can actually just say our products are going to be return store.state.catalog. So I'm saying this is the store that our entire Vue object can use. I'm going to look at the state and then I'm going to go ahead and look at the catalog. This further protects it from anyone accidentally trying to set the products at any point. The other thing we need to do is in the mounted function here, instead of data store local catalog, we're actually going to say this.store.dispatch. Dispatch is how you end up calling actions. Commit to call mutations, dispatch to call actions. And of course, this action is called load catalog. And so it's important to note that the store object is being put on the this pointer. So we actually have to come down here inside the products function and make sure we're actually calling the store on the this pointer as well. And if I've done everything correct, let's go ahead and run this. You can see it's not working, so let's go ahead and look at our output. And it says Vuex is not a constructor. So of course I made the canonical mistake that I always do, is that Vuex is actually the namespace and the object is called store. So we come back and refresh. We'll see that it's now working. We're getting all the information, but it's centralized directly in the store. So far, we've gone through a lot of hoops just to get back to the same functionality we had. This is probably not as useful as you might imagine. So if we're doing something simple, Vuex does require you to understand more of these concepts and jump through a few more hoops to make them work. But I think as you'll see, as we start to dig into using Vue from a different component, you'll start to see why the complexity ends up being a benefit over time. Let's do that next. So now let's see how Vuex works across components. If we open up the data store again, let's go ahead and add a second piece of state here called the cart. If you remember here at the index page, this is where we were defining the cart item. So let's get rid of it there. And let's take this on by, and let's move this over to the store. And we'll do that by creating a new mutation called add to carts. And just like before, we're going to pass in the state, and then we're going to pass in the new piece of data, which is the product that they chose. We can still use the same data here, where we're checking to see whether it's being added, but instead of adding it to this cart items, let's say state.carts and state.cart for the push as well. Now that I have this add to cart, let's go over to the index page and just make our buy button call that. And I can do that by just saying this.store.commit add to cart. And then I can just send in that product to the cart. Again, remember that the add to cart is taking two parameters, an object that represents the state in the store, and then whatever parameters I'm being sent. Because I'm sending down the product to be able to do this work, I'll want to make sure I send it in the commit call. But if you remember in the index, we're using a property to bind to the items on our main view. So the main view is being responsible for both data that's data directly in the cart as well as in the main view. And that doesn't really work. So I want to get rid of these cart items themselves and make the cart itself responsible for the cart items. And what I can do to do that is first get rid of the props here. And I can add a computed section like we did before. And let's go ahead and just create a section for items. And that'll be a function that just returns this.store.state.cart items. Remember, these cart items were added to the data store actually as cart. So let's go fix that. It should just be cart. But how did this store end up here in the component? As I alluded to before, in our main view object, because we're specifying the store here, the store that we're specifying is being passed down to every component that this view object uses as well. So often the view object is going to be thin because you're going to put most things in components. This is a way to propagate and share that store object across those different components. It's kind of where the magic happens. So we don't have to send the information to the cart. We could just use this items instead of it being a property. It can actually be a computed object that it gets it from the state in our store. And with luck, if I've done this right, we can see that our cart continues to work, but we've taken the view here in the product list out of responsibility for actually doing the work here. We're still going to need to figure out how to fix the subtotal here, but the actual showing of the cart is actually working exactly the way it was before without it having to manage the cart data. This should just be responsible for showing the product list and then letting the store know that something wants to be purchased. And then this component can find out that the data has been changed in the store and then reflect it using data binding. We're trying to separate the concerns here. So we've still got some mixed responsibilities between what the cart's responsible for and what the product list is responsible for. Let's clean some of that up next. So now let's finish the job of separating the responsibilities between the product list and the cart. If we go back to the index page, we'll actually see that there's this delete item here in the index page itself, though this delete item is actually communicated from the cart. Now, when the cart was just pure UI, that might be appropriate, and there may be some cases where you actually want that. But for us, that's not really what we want. So we're going to actually get rid of this delete item entirely. And in the index, we're actually going to remove this as firing an event. The cart itself, if we look at the cart HTML, we can see that on click here, we're emitting the data. Instead of emitting it, let's go ahead and call an onDelete item with our item, because this event, even though it was useful to show you how to fire events, the reality is we can handle all the deletion of the item ourselves because the cart is now self-responsible. So we can go ahead and add a methods section, and we'll go ahead and do the delete item ourselves. The difference here, we actually want this work to be done where? We want it to be done in the store, and we're going to commit delete item, and we're going to pass it that line we were given. Now, we could certainly have left all that code here and not put it in the data store, but this might not be the only place where we do the delete item. And instead of making cart ultimately responsible for always deleting items in a cart, you can imagine later on we might want to delete an item from the cart when we're actually doing checkout and stuff. We're centralizing again in this data store. So let's add another mutation for delete. Let's call it cart item because we're trying to make it a little clear. And then we'll do a function, again passing the state, and then passing that line that we're going to be given. And I'll just paste that same code in here, except instead of looking at the cart items, we're going to look at the state.cart items. And just like here before, we're also going to do state cart item. So we're doing the deletion by getting rid of it in the index for us. And let's just make sure that this name is the one we're going to use here in the commit. Go ahead and fix that. And so now instead of there having to be this communication back and forth between the index page, it doesn't need to be responsible for deleting items at all. The only reason we're having it responsible for buy is because the purchase decision, the buy, is actually happening on the product page. So again, if I've done this correctly, I should still be able to buy items and should still be able to delete items. But of course, that's not working, and let's figure out why. It says cart items is undefined inside the data store. So in our data store, our items are called cart, not cart items. So let's just make sure we have the right name here. Since I've named them in different ways in a bunch of different places, this is not surprising. Let's go ahead and refresh and see if that fix did it. And it did. So we're able to add and remove items, and that the cart is responsible for the functions that are responsible for the cart. Now the subtotal is a little different here, because if you remember, we're actually supplying this as a slotted element. But subtotal no longer has that responsibility. Subtotal can no longer, remember this is a computed value, be gotten from the cart items because cart items doesn't even exist. So how do we do this? We do this just by changing store.state.cart, and then the rest of it should continue to work. Now, the reality is the subtotal should probably be in the cart itself. So let's get rid of it here. And in the cart, we'll just go ahead and add another computed element for it. And of course, this isn't going to be doing exactly the same thing. It's still going to be returning the same sort of subtotal. But instead of passing it in from the index, which was more than anything an excuse for me to be able to show you footer and headers and the way that slots work, but I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this and just put it in the cart where it probably belonged the whole time. Because the subtotal now exists on the cart itself and has that same responsibility, we should be getting subtotals now. If I did it all right, as we buy, we'll see that the subtotal is now being updated. Still getting that slotted announcement at the top, which is something that we could leave used by whomever uses the shopping cart, but we'll be able to get exactly where we want to be for now. So we've moved all the functionality that was really mixed between the product list, the shopping cart, even some other places, all into the shopping cart using the Vuex store to solve a lot of the centralization problems. Again, we're not only building that component so that we can use it in different places, but as we go through, we're going to be using that store component to save data, to know it's changed, those sorts of things. And so we're really getting a benefit there. One other thing that will be important for you to know is as an application grows larger and larger, you might want to segment your data into different pockets. Let's take a look at how to do that next. So next, let's talk about modularizing Vuex stores. So we look at the data store, we can really think about this first object as being one large object that represents something, and I'll do that by calling it the catalog. And it's just that same object that represents what we want, but we might want to have different regions of data. So let's create a customer as well as just another object, but it's going to maintain the same sort of structure. I'm just going to give it a state for now, but we could certainly have mutations, actions, and getters. But the only state here, I'm going to have a customer object that is just going to be an object. Not a lot of data in here. We're not going to worry about building this up too much. We'll use this a little bit later. But the Vuex store is going to allow us to create one store so it's still a singleton that we're going to use across our application. But instead of having all these things at the top level, I can set up a section called modules that have named sections of the store. So I'll call this the catalog and assign it our old catalog. And I'll say the customer is our customer state. What's interesting about this is that as your application becomes more complex, each of these modules can also have their own section of modules. And so you can think about this as being modules all the way down if that's what you really wanted to do to structure this. So we still have this single data store that has all that same catalog information, and now we're introducing customer information. And instead of having to test the two, manage them separately, we can actually just have them in this way of having their own modules. But now that we've introduced modules, how do we go ahead and use them? Let's go over to the index page. And really the only change here is in the computed products. Here we're just going to have to put the catalog after the state to have that segmentation. to say the state in the module, call this, and that'll be that. We can do the same thing here in the cart, enter computed for the items. This will be state.catalog and state.catalog there as well. So one thing you'll notice is that the amount of places that we're actually touching this aren't a whole lot. If I'm lucky, this should all continue to work now that we've modularized our code. All we've really done is now segmented the state into these different modules. But you'll notice we didn't have to change any of the commits or any of the dispatches. The reason for that is data store optionally will let us tell it that we want to say that our module is namespaced. All this does is tell it that any of the mutations, actions, or getters are going to be using a namespace structure. So here, because we've said is namespaced, when we call commit, is add the name of the namespace before it. So the catalog for that, the catalog there in dispatch, and over in the cart we'll need to do the same thing. The delete item is now the catalog / delete item. And let's make sure everything still works. So the benefit here is allowing you to have these commits with or without a namespace. What's interesting about the way the data store works when you don't have it namespaced is it'll take all the mutations, all the actions, all the getters, and use them and flatten them out regardless of what the modules are. Namespaced helps when you start to get a really complex system and you might end up having name collision and those sorts of things. But in many cases, I wouldn't even bother with turning on namespaces unless you really have a good reason to worry about the level of complexity you're dealing with. I like the fact that these calls to commit and dispatch are nice and simple. And so on the whole, I won't use namespaced, but I did want to introduce it to you because as you get into larger and larger applications with Vue, this is going to become more and more important. Let's wrap up this module. So we've talked about centralizing state across our application. I showed you a pattern for using singletons to share state across your applications, and I also introduced you to some of the problems with that in the way that Vue handles object identity and having to deal with binding with callbacks and those sorts of things. I also introduced you to the idea of a Vuex data store and that can simplify data mutation by funneling it down into only a few different calls. Even though to use Vuex can add complexity in the number of concepts the developers will need to know, it reduces complexity in that debugging large applications should be a lot easier. In the next module, we'll talk about single-page applications, introducing routing, and using build tools.